You wake up on a damp morning somewhere in the 14th century. The air smells like a mix of moldy straw, unwashed bodies, and the faint, ever-present stench of livestock that has nowhere else to go but your nostrils. Your mattress is basically a pile of hay that's been reused for 3 pilgrimages and probably still holds the ghost of a rat or two. You stretch, but it only hurts more because your joints haven't yet decided whether they want to keep you upright today or just give up entirely. No heating, no coffee, and definitely no chance to check Instagram to distract yourself from this glorious moment. So before you get too comfortable, and by comfortable, I mean as comfortable as a medieval pilgrim can be, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy this blend of history and mild existential despair. Also, drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining this little trip through medieval misery across the globe, especially since none of us have GPS or even a decent map to help navigate this journey. Now, imagine yourself as a medieval pilgrim. Not some wealthy noble taking a chariot ride. No. You're a regular person, probably poor, a little smelly, and slightly terrified, because you're about to embark on a journey that might take months. Maybe you're heading to Canterbury to see the shrine of Thomas Becket. Or maybe Santiago de Compostela, where a very old and very dusty saint supposedly hangs out. Or Jerusalem, if you're feeling particularly ambitious or desperate enough to dodge bandits and diseases. Pilgrimage was, in theory, a holy act. A way to earn spiritual brownie points by traveling far and wide, often barefoot, through lands infested with all kinds of nasty things, think fleas, bad food, and the occasional violent thief. But what actually happened was a bizarre mix of the sacred and the ridiculous, the pious and the gross, all wrapped up in habits that today would make you question humanity's collective sanity. For starters, pilgrims love collecting souvenirs, but not the cute little fridge magnets or tasteful t-shirts you might buy today. Nope. They collected holy relics. This meant bits of bone, cloth, or even nails that were said to belong to saints or holy figures. Imagine stuffing your already heavy bag with crumbling bits of someone's finger bone because, hey, that might save your soul. There was even a black market for fake relics, so some pilgrims returned home clutching what was basically medieval plastic knockoffs. But this didn't stop them from sleeping soundly, convinced their stinky little bone fragments would protect them from eternal damnation. You're trudging along dirt roads that turn to mud when it rains, which, spoiler alert, it usually does, wearing leather sandals that barely survive more than a few days. Blisters? Oh yes. Your feet are a disaster zone, and you know it. There's no Uber, no Lyft, no electric scooter. Just sandals and blisters and the occasional desperate attempt to ride a donkey that smells like it's had one too many meals of rotten turnips. Food is another nightmare. Forget avocado toast or gourmet coffee. You get stale bread, some cheese that smells like it's made a pact with the devil, and maybe a bowl of barley mush if you're lucky. You'll find yourself eating the same thing day after day, learning to appreciate the subtle nuances of bland with a hint of dirt. Water is risky because rivers and wells are often contaminated, and boiling water isn't really a thing most people mastered. So you might get sick, which is just a part of the pilgrimage experience. Think of it as a medieval version of catching a cold at the worst possible time, except with less modern medicine and more, well, death. Sleep is hard to come by and even harder to enjoy. You might find yourself in a crowded hostel where snoring sounds like a bear with a head cold and the bedding smells like everyone's failed hygiene combined. Privacy? That's a laugh. You share rooms with strangers and personal space is a myth. You're lucky if you don't wake up with someone's foot in your face or a rat nibbling at your ear. Despite all this, people went on pilgrimages for reasons that make sense and some that don't. For many, it was spiritual, seeking forgiveness for sins, hoping for healing miracles, or just wanting to prove their faith. For others, it was social, a chance to escape the grind of their village life, see the world, sort of, and maybe even meet someone interesting. Sometimes, it was just a way to cope with grief or guilt, or to fulfill a vow made under duress. Occasionally, it was simply boredom mixed with wanderlust, the medieval version of I need a break from my annoying relatives. You see, pilgrimages were as much about the journey as the destination. And the journey? It was weird. Imagine a moving circus of mismatched humans and animals, carrying what little they own, trying not to die from exposure, starvation, or bandits. Along the way, you might encounter other pilgrims, some of whom took it very seriously, wearing badges and hats adorned with scallop shells to show off their status, and some who treated the pilgrimage like a medieval spring break, indulging in drinking, gambling, and questionable behavior. It was like the most confusing group trip ever, with everyone balancing between holiness and hangovers. The roads themselves were, well, let's just say they weren't exactly paved with gold. Mostly dirt paths with rocks, holes, and, thanks to the constant presence of livestock and humans, a generous coating of manure. Sometimes you'd have to cross rivers with no bridges, relying on rickety boats or just getting your feet wet and praying you don't catch something nasty. There were no signs, no GPS, and no friendly locals offering directions, mostly because most locals didn't want to deal with smelly, hungry strangers blocking their paths. And then there was the weather. Medieval Europe was, in general, cold, wet, and unpredictable. You might start your day in the freezing fog, only to be scorched by the midday sun, then soaked by an afternoon storm. Your clothes, which probably smelled worse than your shoes, would be damp for days on end. Fungus, lice, and all sorts of skin diseases would consider you prime real estate. On the plus side, you might find a shrine or church along the way where you could rest your weary legs, maybe get a blessing, or at least a cup of questionable broth. Some churches were built right on the pilgrimage routes, funded by the promise of pilgrim donations, and were often the best places to catch a few hours of decent rest and shelter. But even these holy stops were sometimes a chaotic mess, full of beggars, scammers, and animals looking for scraps. By the time you reach your destination, assuming you didn't get robbed, fall sick, or just give up and turn around, you'd probably look like a cross between a drowned rat and a scarecrow. But you'd be proud, too, in a weird, exhausted way. You'd have your relics, your tales of hardship, and maybe even a few new blisters to show for it. And best of all, you'd be one step closer to a shiny ticket to heaven, or so you hoped. So now that you've got a picture of what it meant to be a medieval pilgrim, a walking, talking bundle of blisters and questionable hygiene with a very particular taste for holy souvenirs, you might be wondering how these odd habits even started. Why did people think it was a good idea to travel hundreds of miles on foot, risking everything for a sliver of saint's bone? Well, that's where the history really gets juicy, and by juicy I mean dusty, smelly, and a little bit weird. All right, take a deep breath, or as deep as you can in this imaginary medieval stench, and get ready. We're about to dive deeper into the curious customs and rituals pilgrims embraced along the way. Spoiler, some of them are downright bizarre, some are a little gross, and all of them are perfect to help you drift off into a calm, historical sleep. You're still limping along, the ache in your feet now a familiar companion, like a slightly annoying but reliable friend who refuses to leave. The road is endless and your sandals are threatening to give up the ghost any minute, but you press on. Because that's what medieval pilgrims did. They embraced odd habits like a badge of honor, or maybe more accurately, a badge of blisters and bad decisions. One of the first strange customs you notice is the pilgrimage badge. It sounds harmless enough, right? Like a cute little sticker you'd get for reading a book. But no. Back then, these badges were metal, usually shaped like scallop shells, because apparently, shellfish were the original Instagram likes of medieval spirituality. Pilgrims would proudly wear them on their hats, cloaks, or bags to prove they'd been to a sacred site. It was like a medieval LinkedIn endorsement, except instead of professional skills, you were boasting about how many days you survived on crusty bread and questionable water. Pilgrimage badges weren't just fashion statements. They were protection too. Sort of like a medieval get-out-of-jail-free card, but for the afterlife. People believed these badges would keep you safe from evil spirits and bad luck during your journey. So, you wore that heavy metal shell like your life depended on it, because, honestly, in the Middle Ages, it kinda did. Of course, not all badges were legit. Some enterprising folks realized there was money to be made selling fake badges, because who wouldn't want to pretend they'd been to Santiago de Compostela without actually dealing with the blisters and the bandits? The medieval equivalent of buying authentic designer sneakers off a shady street vendor. But pilgrims wanted to believe so badly that these fakes were still good enough to score them some spiritual brownie points. Speaking of spiritual brownie points, let's talk about the other common pilgrimage accessory, the staff. Not just any walking stick, but a highly decorated, sometimes even carved or painted staff, which doubled as a weapon and a walking aid. You'd lean on this thing when your legs gave out, because they would, several times a day, and also wave it around to shoo off wild dogs, angry locals, or worse. The staff was your best friend, your weapon, your walking partner, and sometimes your crutch in the emotional sense, too. And yes, some pilgrims got really, really creative with their staffs. There are records of them being topped with little bells or carved saints, kind of like a medieval bling-bling. Imagine jingling your way through muddy roads, announcing your presence to anyone nearby, whether they wanted to hear from you or not. You probably sounded like a walking wind chime of despair. Now, we can't ignore one of the more charming habits of pilgrims, their tendency to sing. Not the kind of singing you'd want to hear on a pleasant evening stroll, but more like a mix between chant, prayer, and off-key howling. Pilgrims would belt out hymns or religious songs to keep their spirits up, or to drown out the groans of their aching bodies and the endless squelch of mud underfoot. This singing served multiple purposes. It was supposed to keep the devil at bay, warn other travelers of your approach, and frankly, distract yourself from the gnawing hunger and fatigue. The less musical among them probably just muttered prayers under their breath, but the enthusiastic ones made up for it with volume. Imagine waking up at dawn to a cacophony of nasal religious tunes echoing across a foggy valley. Soothing, right? Oh, and about food again, because no medieval story is complete without a chapter on terrible meals. As you continue your pilgrimage, you realize your diet is so limited it's practically a form of torture. The staple was often hard bread called hardtack, which was so dry and tough it doubled as a weapon in desperate times. You'd chew it slowly, trying to convince yourself it had flavor beyond sad cardboard. If you were lucky, you might find some salted fish or a few scraps of cheese, but more often than not, your meal was a thin, watery broth that could barely qualify as soup. There's a certain grim humor in how pilgrims sometimes carried their own food wrapped in cloth or leather pouches. But it wasn't the gourmet picnic basket you might imagine. It was mostly whatever leftovers they could carry, dried fruits, nuts, or maybe a chunk of jerky, if they were lucky enough to have access to preserved meat. The preservation methods were primitive at best, so the food was often stale or borderline rancid. Eating it was a gamble, nourish yourself or poison yourself. The choice was yours. Now, if you thought carrying all that was bad, wait until you consider the company you kept. Pilgrimages attracted a real cross-section of society. You had devout peasants, worn down by hard lives and hoping for a miracle. You had nobles, traveling with more servants than common sense. You had merchants, thieves, beggars, and the occasional charlatan selling miracle cures and holy trinkets. It was like a traveling circus of humanity's oddest habits and worst hygiene. One particularly odd social custom was the way pilgrims dealt with cleanliness or the lack thereof. Bathing wasn't exactly a daily event. In fact, most pilgrims washed themselves only rarely, and when they did, it was often in the cold, muddy rivers they were also trying to drink from. So you'd get this unique blend of smells: wet wool, sweat, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present hint of animal musk. This aroma had a surprising social function. Other pilgrims could tell a lot about you by your scent. If you smelled like a freshly bathed noble, you were probably someone to avoid because you didn't belong. If you smelled like the river after a rainstorm, you were accepted as part of the pack. The smell was a badge of honor, or at least a badge that said, "I've been walking for weeks and I'm not stopping now." We should also mention the strange habit of pilgrim hospitality. Along the routes, monasteries, churches, and sometimes local villagers would offer food and shelter, but not always out of pure kindness. Often, it was a business. You'd trade whatever little you had for a bed of straw and a meal. And you could bet the meal was the same questionable broth with some boiled vegetables that had seen better centuries. The hospitals along the pilgrimage routes were interesting. They weren't hospitals as we think of them today, with white coats and antiseptics. They were more like communal sick rooms where the ill and injured were thrown together in hope that prayer and a bit of rest might fix them. If you were lucky, a monk might give you some herbal remedy, which was probably just a fancy word for crushed plants and hope. Now, what about the spiritual side of things? Pilgrims believed deeply in the power of their journey to wipe away sins, cure illnesses, and grant miracles. They would stop at shrines and cathedrals, sometimes crawling on their hands and knees up steep staircases, chanting prayers that sounded like a cross between a lullaby and a hostage negotiation. The relics they sought were believed to have supernatural powers, so many pilgrims kissed, touched, or even licked these objects, spreading germs in ways modern science is just starting to understand. Some of these relics were fascinatingly bizarre: a saint's finger, a piece of the true cross, a cloth that supposedly wiped Jesus' face. Whether authentic or not, these relics were the ultimate pilgrimage trophy. You'd proudly parade them around your village, impressing everyone with your evidence of suffering and holiness. By the time you finish this chapter of your journey, you might wonder how anyone survived these pilgrimages at all. The odd habits, the smells, the food, the blisters, the singing, the ridiculous badges, it all paints a picture of a journey that was as much about human endurance as it was about faith. And yet, pilgrims kept going, year after year, century after century. So, rest your weary eyes for a moment and let these thoughts drift through your mind like a slow, muddy river. Remember, the odd habits of medieval pilgrims weren't just quirks. They were the tools, the armor, and the rituals that kept these strange, smelly souls moving toward their holy goals. And don't forget to take another slow breath, maybe wiggle your toes if you still have the energy. And when you're ready, we'll continue to explore the curious rituals and little-known customs that made medieval pilgrimage an unforgettable and sometimes unbearable experience. You've settled into the rhythm of the road now, or as much as one ever could settle into the endless trudge through mud, manure, and misfortune. Your feet have taken on a new shade of medieval misery, and your stomach has become an expert in the fine art of rumbling loudly at the worst possible moments. You're no stranger to the odd habits of your fellow pilgrims either, who have somehow turned suffering into an elaborate performance art. One such habit that immediately catches your attention is the way pilgrims mark their progress. There were no apps, no selfies, no GPS pings. Instead, they collected tokens, mostly badges, as we've covered, but also written notes, sometimes even graffiti left at stops along the way. Yes, medieval pilgrims invented something very close to the original travel blog, except it was carved into church walls or scribbled on parchment that would later be read by other pilgrims, possibly hundreds of miles away. These graffiti inscriptions were often prayers, declarations of faith, or sometimes surprisingly cheeky notes like, "I've been here. I'm tired. When do we eat?" It's comforting to know that even in the 1300s, people knew how to complain with style. Imagine future historians poring over these notes, trying to piece together what life was like while laughing at how some things never change. Another deeply ingrained habit was the ceremonial washing of feet. This wasn't just some casual hygiene practice, but a symbolic act rooted in humility and religious devotion. At some stops, pilgrims would wash each other's feet, or have a priest do it as a reenactment of Christ's humility. Picture a group of tired, grimy pilgrims sitting in a muddy courtyard, passing around a basin of cold water and a scratchy towel, trying not to grimace at the chill or the smell. This ritual was part practical, part spiritual. It helped prevent infections, at least a little, and reinforced the idea that on this pilgrimage, everyone was equal regardless of whether you were a noble or a pauper. In practice, though, some pilgrims probably just wanted to get their feet cleaned without having to do it themselves. After days of walking, this simple act could feel like a little slice of heaven, even if the water was more river scum than spa treatment. You might be surprised to learn that medieval pilgrims were also surprisingly competitive about their journey. Not in a who can finish fastest way, but more in a who can suffer the most and still look pious fashion. There were no medals, but bragging rights were everything. Some pilgrims went to extreme lengths to prove their devotion, walking barefoot over miles of rocky roads, fasting until they could barely stand, or wearing uncomfortable hair shirts that made their skin itch like they'd rolled in a pile of nettles. This self-inflicted suffering was part of a broader medieval mindset that saw pain as a way to connect with the divine. The idea was that enduring hardship here on earth would earn you heavenly rewards later. So, if your sandals shredded your feet raw, you weren't just unfortunate, you were spiritually winning. It's a kind of logic that might make you want to take up modern hobbies instead, like binge-watching TV shows or eating cheese fries. Speaking of suffering, one particularly odd habit was the use of pilgrim badges and souvenirs as healing talismans. Pilgrims believed these objects could cure diseases, protect against evil spirits, or even help women conceive. If you got sick, or, realistically, if you were already sick, you might tie a piece of cloth that had touched a saint's relic around your neck, or hang a badge over the afflicted part of your body. Imagine the medieval equivalent of a health app, but instead of notifications, you had charms dangling from your clothes. Some pilgrims took this to extremes. They'd carry so many relics and tokens that their packs became ridiculously heavy, turning their journey into a literal burden. This wasn't just physical weight, it was a symbolic one, too, a reminder of their sins and the sacrifices they were willing to make. Picture a traveler struggling through mud and rain, groaning under a pack full of saints' bones and holy cloths, all the while chanting prayers to keep going. Now, no discussion of pilgrim oddities would be complete without mentioning the pilgrim's way of speaking. Pilgrims developed their own language quirks and slang, a sort of code that helped them bond and recognize each other on the road. You might overhear them using words or phrases that sounded bizarre or outdated to outsiders, like calling a particularly bad meal monk stew or referring to blisters as holy fire. These terms helped turn shared suffering into a shared culture, making the endless march a little less lonely. In addition to language, pilgrims also developed distinctive clothing styles that were part uniform, part identity statement. The classic pilgrims hat was wide-brimmed and often decorated with shells or badges. It was practical, protecting from sun and rain, but also symbolic, a way to say, yes, I'm suffering, but I'm doing it for God. The cloak was another key piece, often heavy wool that would soak up every drop of rain and stink like a barnyard, but at least kept you warm. Pilgrims also wore sturdy boots or sandals, sometimes patched up with whatever scraps of leather they could find. Footwear was a constant concern. A broken sandal or blistered foot could mean the end of your pilgrimage, or worse, an agonizing detour. So caring for your feet became a daily ritual, involving washing, bandaging, and sometimes desperate measures like rubbing animal fat or herbs onto your skin to soothe the pain. It's the medieval version of putting on your best face, except your face was your feet and best was just barely functional. One particularly bizarre habit was the way pilgrims dealt with bodily functions on the road. Privacy was non-existent, and the rules were simple: find a discreet bush, tree, or ditch and get it over with. This meant you were likely to encounter the smell of, well, everything in the air, mixed with the less than pleasant sights of discarded refuse and waste. Medieval roads were not clean by any stretch of the imagination, and that's putting it politely. Sometimes, pilgrims used makeshift chamber pots or cesspits if they were lucky enough to find shelter with a latrine. These latrines were basically holes in the ground, often shared by dozens of people, and about as hygienic as you'd expect. You might say that the medieval pilgrimage was the original extreme test of how little sanitation a person could endure without completely losing their mind. But amid all this discomfort, there was a surprising amount of camaraderie. Pilgrims would share stories, food, and sometimes even their clothes or shoes with others. If you were injured or sick, fellow travelers might carry you for a while or help bandage your wounds. There was a shared understanding that everyone was in this miserable, muddy mess together, and sometimes that was enough to keep going. Occasionally, you'd come across the odd healer or herbalist who claimed to have potions and remedies to ease your pain or cure your illnesses. These medieval pharmacists might offer a mixture of herbs, prayers, and a hefty dose of optimism. Whether their cures worked or just gave you something to hope for, pilgrims clung to these remedies like life rafts in a stormy sea. As you approach the halfway point of your journey, the landscape begins to change. Villages become more frequent, and signs of civilization pop up: small markets, roadside inns, and even some rudimentary bridges. But don't get too excited. These stops often meant a price to pay: tolls, taxes, and the ever-looming danger of thieves preying on weary travelers. Bandits were a real threat. They weren't just shadowy figures in the woods, but sometimes dressed like other pilgrims or even monks to lure you into a false sense of security. Traveling in groups helped, but not everyone had that luxury. The constant worry about robbery added a layer of stress to the pilgrimage, turning every shadow into a potential enemy. So, here you are, halfway through, with tired legs, a heavier pack, and a mind full of strange rituals, smells, and songs. You might question why you're doing this. Maybe you think of modern comforts: a soft bed, a hot shower, a decent cup of coffee. Maybe you curse the day you decided this was a good idea. But then you remember why you're here. For faith, for forgiveness, for the hope that this long, odd journey will bring you closer to something greater. You adjust your pilgrim's cloak, tighten your grip on the jangling staff, and set your sights on the next shrine, the next village, the next patch of somewhat less disgusting road. And with that, take another slow breath. Let the sounds of distant bells and murmured prayers wash over you like a gentle lullaby. We'll pause here, But there's so much more to explore: strange rituals, unusual foods, and even weirder encounters with fellow pilgrims and locals alike. Whenever you're ready, just say the word and we'll keep wandering down this muddy, smelly, fascinating path together. You wake up in a cramped, drafty inn somewhere between two villages, the smell of damp straw and yesterday's ale still lingering in the air. Your back aches, your feet throb with a persistent reminder of every mile traveled, and your stomach grumbles in protest. Welcome to medieval pilgrim lodging, aka the original budget accommodations experience minus any of the modern conveniences you might take for granted. These inns, or hostels, were often little more than barns repurposed for human habitation. Imagine trying to rest in a room filled with snoring travelers, their boots lined up in a muddy mess by the door, and the occasional clucking chicken wandering freely. Privacy was a concept that didn't exist here, and personal space was a luxury only the wealthy could afford, which you are decidedly not. You might share your sleeping space with a dozen or more fellow pilgrims, packed shoulder to shoulder on thin straw mattresses, or sometimes just rough wooden planks. If you're lucky, you might have a blanket. More often, you rely on your cloak, which by now smells like a mix of sweat, mildew, and unwashed bodies. Think ode to despair. And the noise. The soundscape of these inns was a symphony of coughs, snores, whispered prayers, and the occasional argument over who snatched the last piece of stale bread. It's a lullaby of medieval misery that's oddly comforting once you get used to it, or at least, it's the kind of background noise that can help you drift off after a long day of trudging along dusty roads. Before you lay down, you'll want to take care of your feet again. The ritual of soaking and bandaging is both a practical necessity and a grim reminder of how far you've come. Using whatever herbs or salves you've managed to scavenge, you carefully clean your blisters and wrap them in strips of cloth, hoping the pain will dull enough to allow some sleep. Food here is basic at best. The innkeeper offers you a bowl of thin pottage, a watery stew made of barley or other grains, often flavored with whatever vegetables or bits of meat are available. There's no avocado toast or gourmet cheese platter. Just a bowl that tastes like disappointment mixed with a hint of mud. If you're lucky, there might be a loaf of coarse bread, hard enough to double as a weapon, but somehow still your best bet for nourishment. You gnaw on it slowly, reminding yourself that every bite brings you closer to your spiritual goal. The idea of comfort food is a distant memory, replaced by the stark reality of survival food. Sometimes, a fellow pilgrim will share a piece of dried fruit or a handful of nuts, and these small gestures create fleeting moments of warmth in an otherwise harsh environment. Sharing is survival, and in these inns, generosity is as vital as your walking staff. The inn's hearth, if it has one, is often just a pile of barely burning logs, providing a flicker of warmth and a small consolation. Around it, pilgrims gather to exchange stories, prayers, and sometimes rumors, because nothing fuels a long journey like a bit of gossip about miraculous healings or the next shrine's supposed dangers. These conversations might seem repetitive or dull, but they serve a purpose. They distract from the aches and the cold, build camaraderie, and help pass the endless hours between waking and the next day's departure. Hygiene remains a challenge. There's usually no running water, just a basin you share with others, and bathing is still rare. You might rinse your face with cold water, grimacing at the chill, but a full bath is a luxury for the privileged, not the pilgrim. The medieval world wasn't big on personal space or privacy, and the inns reflected that reality. You learn quickly to accept close quarters, shared smells, and a lack of quiet. It's part of the ritual, a test of endurance and humility. As you lay your head down on the rough pillow, the distant toll of a church bell echoes through the night, marking the passage of time and reminding you of the journey ahead. Sleep comes slowly, wrapped in the comfort of shared suffering and the hope of spiritual reward. In the morning, the routine begins again. You rise with stiff limbs, wash what you can, and prepare to step back onto the road. You pack your few belongings, check your badges and staff, and say quiet prayers for strength. Outside, the world awaits with its unpredictable mix of weather, terrain, and encounters. The road will bring more hardships, but also moments of unexpected kindness, beauty, and revelation. So, breathe deeply. Let your body rest in this moment of pause. When you're ready, we'll continue unraveling the strange, often uncomfortable, but always fascinating world of medieval pilgrims and their odd habits. You step back onto the road, the chill morning air nipping at your face as you adjust your cloak, now a little stiffer from last night's damp. Your boots crunch on the gravel, or more accurately, they squish through a mix of mud, manure, and the remnants of last season's leaves, nature's original mud bath, no spa required. As you trudge forward, you can't help but notice the curious relationship pilgrims had with animals on their journeys. It wasn't just about the horses and donkeys that carried goods or the occasional pack mule you might rent for your heavier items. Oh no, medieval pilgrims had some truly unique interactions with the beasts around them. First, there's the ever-present problem of fleas, lice, and other tiny tormentors. Your clothes and hair were prime real estate for these medieval freeloaders, and no amount of washing in cold streams or river water seemed to deter them. Pilgrims tried everything, from combing their hair with fine-toothed combs to rubbing herbs like rosemary or lavender into their clothing in hopes of warding off the critters. Imagine walking for days, itching and scratching, all while trying to look solemn and devout. It's like attending a fancy dinner party with a swarm of mosquitoes as your guests, except the mosquitoes are relentless, and the party never ends. Then there were the animals that traveled alongside pilgrims, but weren't exactly invited guests. Stray dogs and cats often tagged along, scavenging for scraps and providing a weird kind of companionship. Some pilgrims even welcomed these furry hitchhikers, seeing their presence as a form of protection or good luck. But not all animals were welcome. Birds, especially crows and ravens, were notorious for snatching food and sometimes swooping close enough to make you question your life choices. You might try to shoo them away with your staff, only to have them return moments later like tiny, wing pickpockets. On a more practical note, many pilgrims relied heavily on their horses or donkeys to carry their heavier loads. These animals were indispensable, but caring for them on the road was a full-time job. You had to find fodder, water, and safe places to rest your animal companion. No easy task when you yourself are exhausted and hungry. You quickly learn that the bond between a pilgrim and their beast of burden is a complex one, part partnership, part grudging necessity. There's a strange comfort in hearing the rhythmic clop of hooves on cobblestone, a reminder that you're not entirely alone on this long, strange journey. Animals also played a more symbolic role in pilgrimages. Some shrines were famous for their associations with particular creatures. For example, the shrine of St. James in Santiago de Compostela, where many pilgrims hoped to arrive, was linked to scallop shells, hence the iconic pilgrim shell badge you've seen so many wear. These shells were not just souvenirs, but symbols of safe passage and spiritual cleansing. Pilgrims would often carry a scallop shell tied to their bags or hats, signaling to others that they were on this sacred journey. It was a medieval version of, "Hey, I'm on a quest, don't mess with me," which, spoiler alert, didn't always prevent local bandits or skeptics from hassling you. Speaking of symbols, pilgrims were surprisingly fashion-conscious in their own peculiar way. You might see colorful ribbons, embroidered badges, or even specially woven sashes designed to show allegiance to particular saints or shrines. It was like wearing your fandom on your sleeve, or in this case, your cloak. Despite the discomforts, these little touches help create a sense of identity and pride. It was a way to say, "I'm suffering, yes, but I'm doing it with style." Or at least, medieval style, which often involved mud stains and the faint aroma of livestock. Food continued to be a challenge. On the road, meals were irregular and often barely edible. Pilgrims relied heavily on simple staples like bread, cheese, and dried meats, foods that could survive long journeys without spoiling. Fruits and vegetables were rare treats, and fresh meat was a luxury usually reserved for feast days or wealthy travelers. One odd habit related to food was the way pilgrims sometimes fasted or limited their intake to show devotion. This wasn't just a religious thing, but also a practical measure to avoid the dangers of eating questionable food or drinking contaminated water. Fasting was a form of self-punishment and spiritual cleansing rolled into one, because nothing says I'm holy like willingly feeling hungry and weak on a dusty road. Drinking water was another risky affair. Wells and rivers could be contaminated, but options were limited. Often, pilgrims drank ale or beer, which was safer because the brewing process killed many pathogens. Yes, medieval pilgrims were among the first responsible drinkers, choosing fermented beverages over suspicious water sources. Cheers to that. Sometimes, pilgrims would stop at monasteries or churches that offered hospitality and food. These sanctuaries were like oases in the desert, places where you could wash your face, fill your belly, and maybe catch a few hours of real rest. But hospitality came with its own rules, and pilgrims had to navigate the sometimes strict regulations or expectations placed upon them by the religious hosts. All these little habits, the way you cared for your animal companions, managed pests, rationed food, and dressed your part, were part of a complex dance. A dance of survival, devotion, and an unyielding hope that each step brought you closer to grace. By now, your journey has settled into a strange kind of rhythm, part misery, part camaraderie, part spiritual quest. You might feel your body growing stronger even as it protests, and your mind drifting between exhaustion and the faint glimmers of hope. So take a deep breath, adjust your pack, and get ready to press on. There are still countless miles ahead, each with their own odd customs, strange encounters, and little moments that make this pilgrimage an unforgettable experience. When you're ready, just say the word, and we'll continue down this winding, dusty path into the heart of medieval pilgrimage life. You wake up again, but this time the sun is higher in the sky, its light filtering through the leafy canopy overhead. You're not in a stuffy inn or barn. No, you're outdoors, on the side of a dirt road lined with wildflowers, brambles, and the occasional buzzing fly. The sound of birds chirping feels almost foreign compared to the usual cacophony of snoring and coughing you've become accustomed to. You stretch, feeling every ache and stiff joint protest, and remind yourself that the road waits for no one. You pull your cloak tighter against the morning chill and start walking. But today, you're thinking about something a bit more curious. The hygiene habits of medieval pilgrims, or more accurately, the sheer lack thereof. You see, medieval Europe was not exactly known for its sparkling cleanliness. Bathing was rare, and the very idea of washing your body daily was often met with suspicion or downright horror. The prevailing wisdom was that water opened the pores and allowed disease to enter, a theory that, frankly, makes you question medieval medical advice, but here we are. Most pilgrims wash their faces and hands whenever possible, often using cold water from a stream or basin. A quick rinse, a splash, maybe a wipe with a cloth, but that was about it. Full baths? Those were reserved for royalty or the exceptionally wealthy. For the rest of you, the closest you got was the occasional rinse in a cold river, which felt less like cleansing and more like punishment. The smell? Oh yes, smell was part of the experience. Your body carried the scents of days on the road, sweat mixed with the ever-present dust, a hint of unwashed wool from your cloak, and the unmistakable aroma of animals, your own and those you traveled with. It was a pungent perfume, a badge of honor signaling endurance and faith. Lice and fleas were loyal companions, too. Despite combing and attempts at washing, these tiny tormentors feasted on your scalp and skin, causing relentless itching and discomfort. Scratching was a constant, often performed discreetly or during moments of prayer when your attention was divided. And toilets. Let's talk about those. The idea of a bathroom was very different from what you know today. Most pilgrim routes had basic latrines if you were lucky, or you simply found a secluded spot behind a bush. Privacy was minimal, and sanitation was not exactly a priority. The concept of washing hands afterward was hit or miss, depending on your resources and, frankly, how tired you were. This lack of hygiene was not just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Disease spread quickly along pilgrimage routes, fueled by close quarters, shared meals, and the unwashed masses. Outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and other illnesses were common, turning pilgrim gatherings into breeding grounds for sickness. Yet, pilgrims pressed on. For many, the spiritual goal outweighed the physical discomfort. The pilgrimage was as much a test of endurance as it was an act of faith. You embraced the grime and the stink because it symbolized sacrifice, humility, and the stripping away of worldly vanity. Some pilgrims tried to counteract the smell with herbal sachets tucked into their clothing or the occasional sprinkle of rose water, if they could afford it. Others chewed on fragrant herbs like parsley or mint to freshen their breath, although this was less about charm and more about survival when sharing close quarters with strangers. There were also strange rituals surrounding cleanliness. Some believed that washing the feet upon entering a church or shrine was a form of purification, an echo of biblical tradition. Pilgrims might gather around a basin filled with cool water and dip their feet in reverence, momentarily washing away not just dirt, but spiritual impurities. Despite all this, hygiene remained one of the pilgrimage's greatest challenges. It was a daily negotiation between necessity, available resources, and cultural attitudes about the body. Modern sensibilities might recoil at the thought, but for pilgrims, the stink was just another part of the path. So as you continue down this dusty, smelly road, remember, every layer of grime, every itchy scratch, every rough night's sleep is a step closer to your destination. It's not just about getting there, it's about what you endure along the way. Now, take a deep breath, adjust your pack, and when you're ready, we'll move on to uncover even more strange customs and habits that define the lives of medieval pilgrims. You wake up feeling the uneven crunch of gravel beneath your boots, the air thick with a mingled scents of wild herbs, livestock, and, let's be honest, a bit of human funk. The road stretches ahead, winding lazily through fields and small villages, where the chatter of market stalls and the clatter of carts remind you that life outside your pilgrimage bubble keeps moving, fast, busy, and mostly indifferent to your aching feet. Today, you think about the odd little trinkets and tokens pilgrims collected along the way. These weren't just souvenirs, but vital pieces of the pilgrimage puzzle, a mixture of superstition, spirituality, and the medieval version of "look what I did on my vacation." First, the badges. Oh, those badges! They were everywhere, pinned proudly to cloaks and hats, dangling from belts. Made of pewter, lead, or sometimes silver for the wealthier, these badges often bore the images of saints, crosses, or the emblem of the shrine visited. Wearing one signaled your piety and your progress, but also served as a sort of medieval passport. Yes, I've been to Canterbury. No, I'm not just a vagrant. The badges were mass-produced, often cheaply made, and sometimes as fragile as your resolve after a long day's march. But pilgrims prized them like gold. They were proof you had braved the journey and earned spiritual merit, or at least, that you hadn't just faked it. Beyond badges, many pilgrims carried small relics, tiny fragments of bone, pieces of cloth, or bits of wood claimed to be touched by saints or even Christ himself. These relics were believed to offer protection, healing, or good luck. Some pilgrims spent years saving money just to buy one at a major shrine and would guard it jealously. Carrying a relic wasn't just about superstition. It was a way to stay connected to the divine, a tangible piece of the holy world to hold onto when the road felt endless and your body betrayed you. Sometimes, these relics were wrapped carefully in cloth and tied to your staff or worn around your neck. The weight of the relic might be small, but the comfort it provided was immense. Speaking of staffs, your walking stick wasn't just a tool for balance and defense. It was a symbol of the pilgrimage itself. Often carved with symbols or inscribed with prayers, your staff marked you as a traveler on a sacred path. It was your trusty companion through mud, rain, and the occasional hostile dog. But the oddest custom involving the staff was the practice of leaving it behind at the shrine once your journey was complete. Pilgrims believed that surrendering their staff symbolized the end of their wanderings and a spiritual rebirth. Imagine walking hundreds of miles, the staff your constant friend and support, only to part with it in a moment of solemn ceremony. It was both a relief and a small heartbreak. Some pilgrims even decorated their staffs with ribbons or feathers collected along the way, turning their walking stick into a colorful, if slightly battered, trophy of endurance and faith. Then there's the curious habit of pilgrim shells. These scallop shells, often nailed or sewn to hats and bags, were not just decorations but badges of honor. The grooves in the shell symbolized the many paths pilgrims took to reach one destination. The shells also served practical purposes. They could be used as makeshift cups or bowls when food or water was scarce. Dual-purpose gear, centuries before the idea became trendy. If you were particularly resourceful or desperate, you might collect other odd mementos, a stone from a holy river, a sprig of a sacred plant, or even a coin left behind as an offering. These items created a tactile map of your journey, little reminders that the physical pilgrimage was also a spiritual one. Interestingly, the trading and gifting of these tokens created a vibrant economy along pilgrimage routes. Inns, markets, and churches thrived on selling badges, relics, and charms. Some enterprising folk even forged badges or sold fake relics to the unsuspecting, turning pilgrimage into a mix of faith, commerce, and con artistry. Yet, amidst the hustle and bustle of badges and relics, what really stands out is the sense of identity these tokens gave pilgrims. They were walking stories, wearing their faith and their struggles for all to see. And in a world where social status was rigid and often unchangeable, the pilgrimage offered a unique form of expression, one of hardship, hope, and transformation. So, As you clutch your own battered staff and glance at the shell hanging from your belt, remember, these odd little habits weren't just quirks. They were the breadcrumbs marking a path through one of the most grueling spiritual adventures in history. Take a deep breath, feel the weight of your tokens, and rest a moment. When you're ready, we'll continue down this winding, dusty, and oddly fascinating road. You wake up again, or maybe you never fully fell asleep. Those hard nights on stone floors tend to blur the lines between sleep and restless dreams. The road is quiet now, a thin mist hanging low like a medieval Instagram filter, except with more mud and fewer hashtags. Today, your thoughts drift to the social dynamics among pilgrims. Because, let's be honest, when you cram a motley crew of sweaty, smelly, exhausted people into tight inns, crowded churches, and cramped roads, things get interesting. Pilgrimage was a melting pot of medieval society. Peasants, merchants, minor nobles, even the occasional knight or disgraced cleric. You'd think that faith would smooth over differences, but human nature being what it is, you quickly discover that pilgrims brought their social status, prejudices, and petty rivalries with them, like unwanted luggage. In inns, the smell of stale ale mixed with body odor created an atmosphere ripe for gossip and grumbling. The loudest voices were often those with the least patience for the slow-moving or the less devout. "Move along, lazybones. The road waits for no one," someone would shout, their breath smelling like last night's dinner regretted. Competition was real. Who had the finest badge? Who had traveled the farthest? Who endured the worst blisters and still looked halfway decent? Pilgrims often sized each other up, like a medieval version of a social media-like count, but with fewer filters and more scabs. Despite the rough edges, there was a surprising amount of camaraderie. Strangers shared food, swapped stories, and helped each other through the worst parts of the journey. When a fellow pilgrim's foot blister burst open, an event both grotesque and unavoidable, others might carry their pack or apply a makeshift bandage of cloth and herbal salves. Yet, not everyone was a saint. Theft was a persistent problem along pilgrimage routes. Pickpockets and opportunists lurked in busy markets and inns, eyeing the valuable badges, coins, and relics pilgrims carried. You learned quickly to keep your pack close and your eyes sharper. Traveling in groups was safer, but also meant navigating group dynamics. Decisions about pace, rest stops, and routes could spark arguments. Some pilgrims preferred the direct but dangerous roads, while others insisted on detours to visit additional shrines or holy sites. Religious fervor could also lead to heated debates. Was it better to pray continuously, risking exhaustion, or conserve energy for the long walk ahead? Should you fast strictly or allow yourself the occasional slice of bread and cheese? Pilgrimage doctrine was flexible in practice, but everyone claimed their way was the most devout. Interestingly, pilgrim groups often included people of different languages and backgrounds, making communication a patchwork of gestures, broken Latin, and the occasional shouted prayer. You might find yourself swapping simple phrases, learning how to say water or blister in half a dozen tongues. For women pilgrims, the journey was especially complicated. Traveling alone was risky, so many women joined groups or traveled with family members. They faced unique challenges, from harassment to practical concerns like managing menstruation on the road with no privacy or supplies. Some women disguised themselves as men to avoid unwanted attention, a bold and dangerous choice. Others found protection under the wings of religious orders, staying at convents or hospices along the way. Yet, women also played key roles in the pilgrimage economy. Many were skilled healers or herbalists, offering remedies for blisters, stomach aches, and other common ailments. Their knowledge was invaluable and often passed down through generations. Children sometimes accompanied their parents, learning the pilgrimage trade and traditions early. For them, the journey was a strange blend of hardship and adventure, a mobile classroom on faith, endurance, and the strange rituals of medieval life. By now, you see that pilgrimage was as much a social experiment as a spiritual one. It forced people from all walks of life into close quarters, revealing both the best and worst of human nature. So, as you lace your boots and adjust your pack, take a moment to appreciate the strange, chaotic fellowship of the road. Despite the mud, the blisters, and the questionable hygiene, these odd little communities of pilgrims carried the spirit of hope and perseverance. When you're ready, we'll continue exploring the curious rituals and customs that made medieval pilgrimages unforgettable, often in ways you'd never expect. You wake again to the faint sound of bells ringing in the distance, carried softly by a gentle breeze that stirs the dusty leaves overhead. The path beneath your feet is uneven, cracked by the countless footsteps of pilgrims who came before you, each one chasing salvation, or maybe just a break from their daily misery. Today, your mind drifts to the foods pilgrims ate, or more accurately, the foods they endured. Because medieval pilgrim cuisine was about as glamorous as a sack of stale hay, but somehow, you survived on it. There's no Uber Eats, no avocado toast, no artisanal lattes in hand. Just whatever you could carry, barter for, or find along the way. Pilgrims' diets were humble, repetitive, and occasionally downright dismal. Breakfast might be a chunk of coarse bread, often stale, eaten dry or dipped into sour wine or weak ale. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of coffee, except the coffee is replaced by fermented grape juice, and the kick is more about the alcohol than caffeine. This wasn't the kind of breakfast to energize you. It was the kind that reminded you why you set out on the road in the first place. Lunch and dinner were usually porridge made from barley or oats, boiled into a thick mush that stuck to your ribs but didn't quite satisfy hunger. Sometimes, if you were lucky, there'd be salted fish or dried meat, tough, chewy, and salty enough to double as a footscruff. And if you came across a village market, maybe you'd trade a few coins for cheese, apples, or onions, foods that smelled strong enough to mask the omnipresent body odor. Pilgrims often carried small dried cakes called hardtack, rock-hard biscuits designed to survive long journeys. They were so hard, you had to soak them in liquid before attempting to eat, or risk breaking a tooth. These biscuits were the ultimate survival snack, but not exactly a gourmet treat. Water was both essential and risky. Drinking from streams and wells was common, but often led to illnesses thanks to contamination. Some pilgrims boiled their water if they could manage a fire, but many just crossed their fingers and drank straight from a source. On special occasions, such as arriving at a major shrine, pilgrims might enjoy a feast provided by the church or local patrons. These feasts were rare, a brief reprieve from the monotonous diet of barley mush and stale bread. The food would include stews with root vegetables, occasionally meat or poultry, and sometimes sweetened with honey. Despite the scarcity and repetitiveness, food had a ritualistic significance. Eating was an act of survival, but also a way to maintain physical and spiritual strength. Sharing meals was a communal event, fostering bonds among weary travelers. Interestingly, pilgrims believed that fasting and food deprivation could bring them closer to God. So sometimes, they voluntarily ate less or worse food as a form of penance, making their already tough diet even tougher. Imagine voluntarily giving up your last piece of bread to prove your devotion, pure medieval masochism. On the road, food also became currency. Pilgrims traded pieces of bread for favors, advice, or help with a blistered foot. Hunger was a constant companion, sharpening the senses and sometimes the tempers. So as you chew on your metaphorical medieval ration, probably something tough, bland, and questionable, remember this: every bite was part of the pilgrimage experience, a test of endurance not just a body, but a spirit. Now, take a slow breath, feel the weight of your empty stomach and tired legs, and when you're ready, we'll wander further into the strange and sometimes uncomfortable customs that define the pilgrim's journey. You wake once more, or maybe you never fully do. Just a slow drift between consciousness and the kind of half-sleep that lets your mind wander down the dusty, winding roads of medieval Europe. The air is cool, carrying faint hints of wood smoke and crushed herbs, mixed with the ever-present musk of countless travelers. Today, you find yourself thinking about the strange and often unsettling healing practices pilgrims used to treat their aches, pains, and, let's be honest, diseases that would make a modern doctor faint. Medicine on the road was a patchwork of folk remedies, religious rituals, and a dash of superstition, so thick you could almost taste it. When your feet blistered or your muscles screamed after a long day's walk, you didn't have the luxury of modern ointments or antibiotics. Instead, you might have used poultices made from mashed herbs, honey, or even animal fats. These were slathered on wounds in the hope of warding off infection, or at least disguising the smell. Herbs were the medieval equivalent of the pharmacy. Pilgrims and local healers alike relied on plants like rosemary, lavender, and sage to soothe aches, reduce fever, or calm the stomach. You might carry a small pouch of these aromatic herbs, rubbing them into your skin or steeping them in water to make a healing tea. If you were feeling particularly desperate or superstitious, you might turn to more unusual treatments. Some believed that touching the relics of saints could cure illness. Others practiced the art of sympathetic magic, using objects associated with a disease or the patient to draw out the sickness. It's not exactly evidence-based medicine, but hey, faith was a powerful placebo. Bloodletting was another common treatment, despite its dubious effects. A barber surgeon or monk might prick a vein or apply leeches to balance the humors and restore health. Spoiler alert, this usually just left you weaker and more prone to infection. For mental anguish or spiritual crisis, pilgrims might seek solace in prayer, confession, or rituals involving holy water and relics. The church was both a hospital and a sanctuary, offering healing that was as much about the soul as the body. Sometimes, healing involved ritualistic behaviors that look strange to us now. Walking barefoot over hot coals, wearing specific amulets, or repeating prayers a certain number of times were all believed to have curative powers. The line between medicine and magic was very thin. Interestingly, some pilgrims brought with them written charms or prayers on parchment, believed to protect against illness or misfortune. These talismans were treasured, carried close to the body, and often blessed by clergy. You might also encounter holy wells along the route, springs reputed to have healing properties. Pilgrims bathed wounds or drank the water, hoping to be cured by divine intervention. Whether the water was magical or just cold and muddy was up for debate. Despite all these efforts, disease was a constant companion. The close quarters, poor hygiene, and physical strain made pilgrims vulnerable to everything from scurvy to plague. Some trips ended not in spiritual enlightenment, but in death, their bodies buried hastily by the roadside. But here's the thing, these odd healing habits weren't just about survival. They were a form of hope, a way to assert control in a harsh and unpredictable world. They kept the flame of faith alive when the body threatened to give up. So, as you ease your weary limbs and imagine rubbing a poultice on a stubborn blister, remember that healing on the pilgrimage was as much about belief as it was about herbs and prayers. Take a slow, calming breath. Feel the weight of your journey, physical, spiritual, and otherwise, and when you're ready, we'll continue down this fascinating road together.